Good, so that's Noam Chomsky for you. I'll make a few introductory remarks if you let me, and then open it up for discussion. So the way in which this debate with Chomsky evolved, right? There are different priorities we can set for ourselves for political action, and in this Global Justice Conference this year, we had these strands all represented. So one strand is the strand of truth. We should, as activists, be interested in bearing witness, in setting the record straight, in correcting misrepresentations of history. So the first book that I ever read by Chomsky was American Power and the New Mandarins, was an amazing example of that. Just picking pieces of history and setting the record straight, saying this is how it's being taught, and this is what really happened, with tremendous documentation. He was also involved in the American History Project with Howard Zinn, for example, wrote volumes of that. And you might say, this is worth doing, even if it doesn't have much of a political effect. Of course, we hope it will have an effect. We hope it will change people's consciousness, make them more critical, more anti-authoritarian, will galvanize political action. But even if it doesn't, it is important, if only for the victims, even if they are long dead, to say what really happened to them and to set the record straight. Now, the second thing that we attempted to do is to help people who we see are suffering, are being victimized, are suffering injustice. So we see in the moment ICE throwing out people from our country, and people are grabbed, they are taken into detention, they get superficial hearings and are thrown out. Families are being divided. This is also true of refugees, asylum seekers, where the children are separated from their parents. So there's immediate injustice, and we feel we have to do something about that. We have to use our legal expertise, perhaps, to represent them in court cases, and we have to donate money in order to help them in one way or the other. One thing that moved me in recent years was the Rohingya crisis, where somewhere close to 1 million people were brutalized by the Myanmar army and then displaced into Bangladesh, where they now have an extremely precarious existence. The latest is that the Bangladeshi government is trying to move them to an island where their opportunities would be even more restricted because they don't want them to become long-term residents within Bangladesh. They've been through some of the worst that you can ever imagine, and the world community is not getting it up to help the Bangladeshi government to take good care of these people now, which is quite amazing. In the immediate aftermath, everybody said, yeah, I'll give a little money, I'll give a little help, but now the crisis is forgotten. So then there's the third thing, and it's on a spectrum with the second, and that is the hope for lasting, substantial change, structural change, fundamental change, where you say, in analogy to that silly fish thing, you don't just teach a person to give the person a fish, but we teach them to fish. We shouldn't just pick up the pieces, we shouldn't just repair all the damage that is being done by injustice all the time, but we should try to disable the mechanism that is causing all this damage all the time. So we should restore democracy in our country. Once we have a democratic country in which the needs and interests of all citizens count and influence policy, then much of that injustice will no longer be generated, right? It's generated because it's a small number of very rich people and very powerful corporations that are running this country, and that causes all the damage. So instead of picking up the pieces and repairing some of this damage, it would be much better if we could change the mechanism in a fundamental way. And so that is what I was trying to push Chomsky to talk more about. And of course he said two somewhat contradictory things, right? On the one hand, he said, yes, we have to focus on these things. The world is in a precarious state. We have very limited time. We have to focus on these great issues of climate change, of security, weapons of mass destruction. But on the other hand, he also said, do what engages you. If you feel like you want to work in your local community, by all means, work in your local community. If you feel you want to work on the black kids getting shot, work on that. You know, whatever grabs your attention, devote yourself to that. And towards the end, again, he was talking about you're confronted with this, you know, maybe a village in remote Colombia or an issue here or there, it grabs you, you can't help it, you get dragged into that and you work on it. But if we all do that, you might say, then we will never achieve any kind of fundamental lasting change, because there are going to be too few of us in any one of these many, many different battles. And we will not really undo or not really divert human history in a way that will help reduce the amount of injustice that is being generated all the time. So what would this sort of strategy, this grander strategy of changing the world, changing it fundamentally, changing it structurally, what might that look like? Well, the first thing is you have to think about what are the grand issues, the strategic issues, where you say, if we could win this, then many other things would fall into place. This domino is an important domino. If we could topple it, other dominoes would be much easier to topple. We could achieve much more. Right? One candidate that we heard at this conference about was an amendment that would basically overrule the Supreme Court's insane judgments on Buckley v. Vallejo and Citizens United. These cases where the Supreme Court said that the First Amendment, freedom of speech, protects the giving of unlimited amounts of money into political campaigns. That is a grotesque misinterpretation of the Constitution, at least according to me and anybody who can read. But it is what the Supreme Court declares, and there's no higher Supreme Court that we could appeal to overrule that. But, of course, a constitutional amendment could overrule that, could set that right. And that is one very good way forward, potentially. But I have worked, I've thought about this a lot, of course, to think about, you know, what could be a strategic, important change maker like that. And I came up with this thing that Chomsky was alluding to towards the end, intellectual property rights, right? So we are living in a world in which most people believe that if we want innovation, we have to give people temporary monopolies. We have to give them patents to allow them to charge licensing fees or to mark up their products by very large amounts in order to incentivize them to innovate. But that's not the only way to reward them and to allow them to recoup their R&D expenses. Another way of doing it is to say, if you invent something new, then we will pay you rewards in proportion to the social value of what you invented. So if you have a new medicine, by all means, register it with us, and we will measure the impact. We'll see how human lives become longer and healthier as a result of your medicine, and we pay you accordingly. On condition, of course, that you sell the product at cost price, that is to say, at the cost of manufacture and distribution. So I did this for pharmaceuticals, it's called the Health Impact Fund, but it could easily spread to other areas of innovation as well, for example, green technologies, right? Currently, we live in a world where if somebody invents some nice new green technology, then the only way they can profit from that is by asking for a patent, getting a patent, and then charging everybody else for the privilege of using it. To which the response all too often is, screw you, I'm not going to use it, and if I have to pay extra, I'm going to use this good old Soviet model electric power plant, and I'm going to burn coal just the old-fashioned way. I don't have to pay anybody for that, and I create my electricity that way, and you won't get anything. But who suffers from that? Well, we all do. We all suffer the consequences of these new green good technologies not being used. It's totally insane. It would be much, much better to say to green innovators, you will be paid according to the emissions that you keep out of the atmosphere. that would completely reverse the incentives. Instead of green innovators running around looking everywhere, is anybody using my technology without my permission, without paying me? They would say, please use my technology. Please, I help you. I show you how it works. I give it to you for free. And the more people use it, the more money I would get by way of being rewarded for the emissions that I keep out of the atmosphere. So this is the kind of change where you say we want to allow people to benefit from their inventiveness and maybe from their investments into innovation, but we want them to benefit in proportion to the social value of their innovations rather than simply through markups that they charge on the basis of a monopoly. So that could potentially be a major shift that would begin to reverse this incredible inequality. The inequality, of course, is again one of these very deep, very structural things. High inequality tends to reproduce itself because people who have a lot more than others are much better able to influence the rules under which we all live, and by influencing the rules in their own favor, they can increase their own advantage, benefit themselves, and magnify the very inequality that enables them to do that. And so inequality isn't the kind of thing as it's often presented, the pendulum swings this way and swings that way and so on. Inequality is something that is more like a valve. It's pretty easy for air to pass through in one direction, but damn hard for it to pass in the opposite direction. The toothpaste tube is another example of that. So what happens is, revving inequality up, which Reagan said, you need more inequality in order to have better economic growth. Deng Xiaoping said much the same thing in China. So revving it up is pretty easy, but then getting it back down is very hard because the people who have so much more and are therefore so much more powerful politically have many different ways in which they can try to resist any attempt to shrink inequality. So that's another thing to focus on. How can we try to reduce inequality? And of course, this little model of innovation that I just described is one way of reducing inequality by denying the innovators who have a fantastic head start with regard to innovation because they're so much richer, denying them these unbelievably large disproportionate profits that they now reap from the fruits of innovation. Very few have the opportunity to innovate in the case of pharmaceuticals because it costs hundreds of millions of dollars to create a new medicine and run it through clinical trials and all that. And so these people then get a monopoly that enables them to make absolutely inordinate profits, which they can make because they're already rich enough to invest in innovation. So then, last point, we have to, the second point was we have to look at the opportunities. What are the sort of deep structural issues that if we could move those, everything else would become much easier? What are the most fertile avenues for social and political change? That was the second point. The third point then is that we have to select them and potentially work together on them. So that goes exactly in the opposite direction of Chomsky's thing at the end. Everybody has to do what they feel most engaged in doing. Whatever grabs you, follow your predilections in that regard. Because if we all do that, if we spread ourselves too thin over many different battles, then there is the danger that we lose pretty much all these battles. And if we can somehow agree to focus on one thing, or maybe even better, if we can agree on a kind of sequence that we say, this is what we start with, let's all do this, let's win it, let's nail it, and then we go to the next thing, which will have become easier thanks to the fact that we won the first thing. A, we have achieved structural change. B, we have reinvigorated ourselves, remoralized ourselves by having had a real victory. We've really achieved something, and that will create more political enthusiasm, more hope, more support for tackling the second issue. So, of course, it matters what the sequence is. We have to start with something where we have real chances of achieving it, and then go to the next thing. Don't start with something hopeless, start with something doable, but important, structural, fundamental, deep. And then go to the next thing. But that requires, of course, that we don't pursue the issue that grabs us immediately and say, this attracts me, this is what we... It's not about recreation, right? Political change is not about making ourselves feel good, doing something that engages us, having a kind of hobby, but it really is, at this point at least, in these relatively desperate times as Chomsky described them, it is really about getting things done, really making a difference, making lasting political change. Anyway, that's my thought, and I think that we could do much better, so I agree with Chomsky's critique that we, the folks who are older than Greta, we who are older than Greta haven't really done all that well, and that includes everybody in this room. Fortunately, we're all on the same, on my side in this case, with the age. So we haven't done very well. We have to do a lot better, and here are some thoughts about what we might do differently and how to do it. So now I want to hear from you. Yeah.
I guess just to push back a little bit on this, like if everyone would just kind of pull together around one issue, because historically it seems like the most successful social movements have been led by people who had personal stake in those movements, and it was really around solidarity then across different particular movements within the bigger wins were pushed for. So I'm thinking about like civil rights era. It was really people with personal stake, but then building solidarity with others who had similar, pushing for similar kinds of wins in terms of what civil rights represented. My other thought is something that seems to be missing now is that there's lots of collective action in moments, but there isn't the popular education that goes with it. So there's not the popular education about how to engage in sort of policy changing activities, but you know, you can turn out 6,000 people at a demonstration. So how to link back up, because when I think of old school labor movements, civil rights movements, etc., there were freedom summer schools, there were reading of, you know, Das Kapital in the, you know, in the factories. There was a real push to educate everyone around how to make changes in our lives versus sort of your paid organizers and then everybody shows up to the event. So I just wonder what you might see as the connections there.
Yeah, these are very good points. I don't want to respond to each point, but let's just see what other people have to say. Make this into a discussion as much as possible. Yeah.
Well, this has these discussions. They're great for me, but they have the I don't know. I feel somehow that we're getting into think tank politics, and real politics is based on emotion and passion. Right now, the passions, unfortunately, are from the right, generated from the right, but look at those passions. They're displacements, they always have been, displacements of affect onto the backs of the immigrant, the marginalized, the racialized. Take back those displacements, turn them back, because why are those emotions displaced? They're displaced because rich people who are stealing our money don't like the public to be angry at them for doing it. So they take those passions and they point it outwards. Let us take back those passions that we do end those displacements and have it right back where the person we hate is not the immigrant. Hey, how about if the person we hate is the rich man with bags of money and he doesn't look like a Jew? He looks like Bezos. That was my thought on it.
other thoughts? Yeah?
I have a comment about what you mentioned about how we reward innovative behavior on the part of the business. I share your concern that the way we provide monopoly power to innovators, that contributes or exacerbates the inequality. But the thing is, one of the enduring features of capitalism is that we have to reward creative minds, inventors, innovators, and give them monopoly power for a limited period of time. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any innovation. And if we look at the former Soviet Union model, except AK-47, there hasn't been any invention that has been widely adopted by people. AK-47 is perhaps the only exception. So my comment is that unless we change, probably we need a different form of capitalism. Under the current form of capitalism, we cannot really restrict monopoly power given to the innovators.
Just one quick sentence. This is exactly the false dichotomy that I'm attacking, right? I'm saying, yes, innovators should be rewarded, but no, not through monopolies. Reward them according to the social value of their innovation. So somebody who invents a vaccine against malaria would still get rich. They would get rich in proportion to the tremendous health impact that such a vaccine would produce. And here, the lives and health of all human beings would be weighted equally. Right? Today, the inventor of not a malaria vaccine, but let's say a cancer vaccine, if there could be such a thing, would get rich because they would sell it to the highest bidder. They would sell it for $500,000 a treatment to a few rich people. In the alternative world, you would get rich by creating a lot of health impact potentially. So innovation would be rewarded, but the kind of reward would be different. It wouldn't work through a monopoly. Any other thoughts? Please.
I'm wondering about this single issue focus, or even the sequential focus on issues. And my concern is who would determine these issues, or the focus of it, the sequence and the timing of it, and who would be at the table and who would be left out. And also then, might that not also enforce a kind of inequity if it's not handled properly? So what would be the way to do it, if at all, that would empower everyone? And can that really be done?
Yeah, it's not been ever done in this way, and that is indeed a very significant difficulty. So one way forward with that might be that you say, first let's get together and talk about criteria. So let's talk one level higher up about what are the appropriate standards or criteria by which we select issues as being particularly important. So there is one thing is how structural or fundamental they are, how they might bring other targets within reach. If we could achieve that, then this other thing would be more easily achievable. Another consideration would be political realism. This is something we can actually achieve, whereas this other thing is very, very difficult to achieve with a very high risk of failure. So we could, this is just off the top of my head, we could have a list of criteria and then think through which of the candidate issues fits these criteria best. But of course, you're completely right that in a way it's more democratic and more according to freedom for everybody just to pursue their own issue. But we have to also learn from the low rate of success that we've had or this mixed record of success that we've had in the last 40 years or so.
But even in even in trying to determine the criteria, who would be the we? that's setting that? And how could it be done in a way that all of the voices, or at least representatives from all of the voices, could truly be there?
Yeah, I mean, you would have to have some sort of a, maybe you can answer that question.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I see the point. This is a very big problem, and the thing is this, sort of, if you look at how corporations do it, right? Corporations have the same problem. They want to influence politics, and they want deep structural change. They get together, and they resolve their differences. They try to work out a suitable agenda and so on. They're fewer in number, so it's a little bit easier to make sure that everybody gets heard and everybody participates. And then when they have an agreement, they descend upon Washington like a ton of bricks, or rather a ton of dollar bills, and get what they want, right? So the thing that I'm attacking with intellectual property rights is a new thing. It came in the mid-90s with the WTO agreement, and it was lobbied for by US corporations from 4 industries: agriculture, pharmaceuticals, entertainment, software. And these industries had different interests, but they resolved their interests, and then they succeeded politically, right? And so the question is, do we want to succeed in a similar way, or is that for us too militaristic, to sort of being straitjacketed into a formation where we work together in lockstep, right? And I can see that worry. I can also see your worry that in the end, have we heard all the voices? Have we made a decision? What happens if we continue to disagree? How are we going to resolve that? Are we then going to abandon the whole idea? But it seems to me at least worth a thought or worth a try to come together and see whether we can agree on such a common agenda. Yeah.
So just thinking about mechanisms for determining how useful an invention is, or how much we care about one issue versus another. I mean, traditionally we've relied on democracy and we've relied on the market. And what you're really describing is a kind of market failure, right? Because if the monopoly for the inventor worked properly, then the money that they got from the monopoly would basically be the amount that people valued it, right? But the market doesn't work that way because it's only the rich people that get to vote, right? So what you need to do is somehow create a market where everyone has 10,000 units, right? And everyone can vote those 10,000 units on whatever it is that they think is most important in their lives. And then, but the problem is that, you know, what I think we're describing here is that the other model that we've tended to use when democracy and the market don't work is we tend to use a sort of expert model. And that has issues about inclusiveness and about power and so forth. So, I mean, academic institutions are another way that we've avoided the perils of people being able to monopolize their research, because if I do research here, technically it's owned by the government that funded it, or it's owned by the institution that's supporting my money, my livelihood, and that's fine. But and you know, in some ways, then the government's determining what gets researched, and so guns aren't getting researched, or you know, something that's not. You know, so. I don't know, there's so many difficulties about how we decide what's important and how we decide what to focus on, that I think that creates a sort of democracy has to be in place before you can even do the activism that you want to do.
Right. So health impact fund model is pretty much that model, that you say people's lives should be valued equally, their health should be valued equally. And so we assume, so to speak, in your metaphor, that people are willing to pay equal amounts. So if I'm going to pay as much for a life extension of 1 year as you would be willing to pay for such a life extension, and then the innovator gets paid accordingly, except that it doesn't come out of our pockets, it's just a proxy, so to speak. Second point, that in the case of campaign contributions, for example, we could have a similar system. We could say this is a system that was proposed by Alscott and Ackerman.
Right.
And the system would be that every person in the United States gets $200, let's say, every election cycle. $200 that is not the usual green money, but in Ackerman's fantasy world it is red, white, and blue. And these $200 can be spent only on political campaigning, and no green money can be spent on political campaigning. So that way everybody would have exactly the same amount, and you could give it to me, I could give it to you, you could give it to a party, you could give it to a political action committee, you could give it to an NGO or anybody else you trust, and then it could ultimately be spent, and we would all have equal weight. You know, that would be a kind of democratization of the process. So it's in that sense a model. Any other thoughts?
If I can add one more point. Chomsky, well, we're also talking about the problem of spreading our energies too wide, too thin, and Chomsky, of course, keeps on pointing us to the fact that the girls in the room, the elements in the room, are nuclear war and global warming. And they have to center our attempts because all of these great strategies, I mean, no medicine in the world is going to be helpful if there are no people in the world. So I think we have to think about it not just in terms of not dispersing our energies too far, but that this whole movement has to grow organically. And organically, a flower doesn't first decide to grow the leaf and then grow the root, or you know, it all grows somehow or other, the seed. Everything grows all at once, organically. And you have to think not only of addressing global warming, but people have to have in their minds, what is life going to be like? Trump can say, they want to take your hamburger and your steak. And he's right. We do. But in the minds of people, what does that mean? That means a terrible life. We have to show them that there's a better life with less. And how can we do that? That's one of the problems that we have, because people aren't going to be able to jump out the window unless they can see that there's something good to land in.
Any other thoughts?
Well, I'd like to say one thing. Of course, when I think about global warming, it's like what Steve was saying, it doesn't really matter everything else. But Chomsky does say something, and I hear it so often. Well, you know, Trump isn't as bad as Hitler. But I think that at the beginning, Hitler wasn't so bad either. And that's why the Germans kind of went along with him. Because he wasn't exterminating Jews yet. So I find that, I just thought that was interesting that he would say that. I hear that so very frequently. Well, Trump isn't this bad, but he's only had 2 years, 3 years. He's really decimated so much. And so I just wanted to throw that in. But it doesn't matter if we're not going to be on the globe, you know, in 10 years. It won't matter what people think about this. That's the very scary thing, really.
So, I mean, the two problems that you mentioned with global warming and with weapons of mass destruction and other dangerous technologies, these are certainly key problems, but in order to solve them, we may need to solve other problems first, right? They may not be immediately attackable, especially the weapons of mass destruction problem. We may have to go through a certain democratization. We may have to reduce the power of big corporations to influence political affairs and so on. This enormous lobbying might that they have in Washington. So, and that in turn will require some democratization, let's say this amendment on campaign contributions, which is, right? So it's a matter of, again, sequencing and strategy on how to get to these existential problems and how to try to solve them. Yeah.
Right, because I think that through the conference of the last 3 days, we already had the sense that unless we take the money out of politics the way we already had them to such an extent, we cannot really consummate the true democratic process, or the democratic process that we already have in place without that money sort of obscuring the entire view. And through this process, we could, I think, quite easily establish what are the most important things for the society, especially considering the looming crisis. So I think we don't have to worry so much up front about what it is exactly that we'll be fighting for, because first we have to fight for something that is unblocking, or that is right now blocking the possibility of having a true open discussion of what is the problem and how we go about solving it.
Yeah, I mean, one massive problem that Chomsky was also mentioning in that context is the problem of tax havens and this totally unaccountable money. He gave a figure of 20 trillion, but according to the estimates I'm familiar with, it's more. It's 32 trillion roughly, and that in an $80 trillion per year global economy. So this is real money. It's an enormous amount of money, and what makes that money so powerful and so dangerous is that it's completely unaccountable. Nobody can trace it, nobody knows whom it belongs to. Of course, it doesn't pay any taxes, which is bad enough, but much more importantly, it is money that can be used for any criminal or political purpose whatsoever. You can give a politician a credit card and say, this card is, it's good up to $1 million, and just take it anywhere, buy anything anywhere. It's untraceable money that comes from the British Virgin Islands or some similar tax haven. Yeah, more thoughts on it.
So my thought is about it's related to what was coming from the questions on the corner up there on the left. And I'm always thinking about the confusion of rhetoric that sometimes blurs the vision of those who want to, with good intention, create progress or ameliorate the conditions of all. For example, when Chomsky was saying that the European Union is taking away democracy from the nations, from the European nations, that's currently a subject that is a flag of the white supremacists and the nationalists in Europe. And I know that Chomsky is saying this from the right corner, from, I would say, from the left. He's saying that these are a bunch of bureaucrats paid by the banks. But if you don't explain that where you are coming from, the people in Italy, in Germany, they think, oh, even Chomsky says this. We have to vote for this xenophobic guy who wants to bomb the ships that are coming with the immigrants. So it seems to me that it is true that probably progress is an organic thing that comes from the bottom up, from pockets of oppositions, resistances, oppositions. What's lacking is the glue. I see the Progressive Front divided. We are lost. So we are lost when a white guy says, identity politics is going to stop this. It's class. I feel lost when I see black folks saying, oh, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is endorsing the white guy. So, and we can be in the same kind of boat, doing this together, but we are constantly suspicious about the key word that for us is identifying our enemy of our particular will. So probably not the sequence of project 1, project 2, project 3, but the glue, the unity that seems to be lost because the scenario is different and more difficult than 40 years ago, probably. But I don't have an answer to this. I don't know where the glue is, or if we have to construct one, so to speak.
And we are all too often conceiving of ourselves as competing with each other. These movements are competing, right? So the Me Too hashtag comes in, and Black Lives Matter is sort of fading away from the scene and so on. And of course we are competing indeed for the attention of people. We are also competing for funding. So in a way this is correct, and we should overcome that and say, no, we have a common enemy that is much more important, or a common goal that is much more important than these little differences. And ultimately the structural problems that are causing all the injustices that we are worried about are the same structural problems. So, but this is something that we have to learn, I think, to work more closely together and to respect and acknowledge one another's priorities. Good. Any thoughts from that corner? Not right now. Good. Any other thoughts from your corner?
Diane, just one more point.
Okay.
If I talk too much already, but it's not so much glue we have to think about as the magnet that draws people.
Yeah.
Take a look at, I love the conference, excellent speech, passionate people, working with such great intelligence, insight and verve in their various areas. But the magnet did not draw the population, did not draw the audience. That's part of the problem, part of the general problem in the small. How do we create something that draws people to a cause?
Yeah, and I think I would say that part of the diagnosis for why that happens is because so many people are demoralized. Right? So many people, I mean, a lot of people are working on some social justice issue or other, but with little hope of achieving any kind of fundamental change. They have some hope that they can help with something here or there, but little hope that they can really change anything in the big way. And this is a huge contrast to maybe our generation or my generation in the 60s. You know, we said we're going to eat this system for breakfast, right? In 3-4 years, we will not know what else to do. We will have won all these battles and stopped the Vietnam War and created a just democracy and so on, and then we'll have to think about what we do with the rest of our lives.
The people who are attracted to the Trump should be all even more demoralized, but they're not. So why do we take it for granted that that we need to be demoralized? We need to find an answer to
I
that.
didn't say we should be demoralized.
No, but you're saying that as a fact,
Yeah.
as a counter to what I suggested.
Yeah. No, it wasn't so much a counter, it was trying to be a diagnosis, an explanation. I was supporting what you were saying as a factual statement,
Yeah,
and then
well,
saying,
beyond that.
why is this happening?
Beyond the demoralization to what moralizes
But
people.
but Trump has managed to, in a way, remoralize people, right?
He's
One
done.
big secret of Trump's
Definitely
success
done.
has been that he told people it's not your fault. If you haven't gotten anywhere economically, if you are no better off than your parents were, it's not your fault. It's the Chinese. The Chinese did this, the Mexicans did this, the immigrants did this. And so you are all right, you're doing well. Don't let anybody tell you that you were weak, that you were unsuccessful, that you played your cards wrong, and so on. So this was a kind of remoralization.
Yeah.
Anyway, I wanted to get more into the issues that you have raised earlier, if possible, but not sure exactly how to do that. Both of you, actually. If you want to get into the discussion a bit more, please do. Or have you said all that you wanted to say?
Sufficient for now for me.
Organizing for social, economic, and political change is something I think about a lot. I'm thinking about what feels different now versus 20 years ago. And this idea of being able to turn out so many people at one-time events, but then when you have longer organizing strategy, organizations or community groups or whatever, people seem to fall away pretty quickly. And how organizing is such a relational activity, but we are in relationship with each other in a different way now. And also thinking about some of the movement history, some of the most powerful movements, there was so much education in those movements. So thinking about Freire, so what have we missed? So we have lots of education now in terms of like memes, right? So people are very aware of the issue, but not so aware of what to do about an issue. And for me, the relationship comes to this idea of learned helplessness and sort of depressiveness around the world is ending, there's nothing I can do. I'm just going to sit at home and look at pictures on whatever social media site of choice, And seeing this in my children and other sort of younger people coming up. Or total passion and then protest, burnout, And how this longer term sort of relational community building around pushing for changes, it seems to be being lost in some ways. And I guess the only other thing I'd add is this idea that there's only so many people doing the work, and that when you're doing organizing, what happens then is you broaden your crowd of who's actively trying to change society versus those few key people, and trying to argue with each other over what is the issue that we should be working on.
The education thing is very interesting, that climate change is a field, for example, where you need quite a bit of education, right? You need to understand, most people don't understand even the very, very most basic things. They don't understand, for example, that global warming does not go up and down with emissions, but it goes up and down with the amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. So even if emissions go down, the amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere continues to go up, and global warming will therefore continue to accelerate. It will be faster because the more gas in the atmosphere, the more energy gets added to the system. So simple things like that, people don't understand.
That kind of education, but also the education of who has power and how does power shift, right? And both warming and democracy are like two peas in a pod, right?
That's right. That's right. And so the question, what are the most plausible measures to be taken about climate change? What is happening? For example, again, people are focusing excessively on very, very small contributors to climate change, are not focusing at all on very large contributors to climate change. So in that sense, are very easily manipulated, and also people don't think hard enough about what the most obvious ways of fighting climate change are. What are the things that we should absolutely make front and center by way of demands? For example, no more coal-fired power plants, right? It's trivial. But if the existing planned and projected coal-fired power plants all get built and all operate for 40 years, which is what the normal lifespan is, so it's 260 years of German emissions. It's an absolutely humongous amount of CO2 that would be spewed into the atmosphere that totally dwarfs all the, whatever you can do with insulating windows and reducing your driving and all the rest of it. Yeah, so that is right. And this education thing, I'm doing a program now in German schools to try to enable teachers to give a competent 11-hour module on climate change in schools, try to introduce that in Europe. So that sort of thing I think is extremely important to get people educated and to oppose this kind of headwind that is saying, well, there are different opinions out there, and the one people are saying this, the others are saying this, and it's very difficult to figure out. There are really no hard facts about this, and no real way for me to know, right? And this is a scientific issue, if ever there was one. We know very precisely what the situation is with regard to greenhouse gases, and we should get people back to the idea that with rational thought you can figure out what's happening and what needs to be done to stop it. Yeah, so I think that is very important, that a kind of disorientation has been deliberately produced. Doubt, it's very hard, who the hell knows, and we as universities could do a great deal to oppose that. Good. Time is up, according to Daniele, but any last words? Any last thoughts, especially those who haven't spoken? I would love to hear from you. Without looking at anybody in particular. Okay. Good, then let me, in conclusion, thank Michal, who has taped this entire recording. Also done two other things. He has taped the interview with Noam Chomsky, and he has dragged me up the Grand Canyon, because we went, in conjunction with Chomsky, we went to the Grand Canyon, went down 1.8 kilometers vertical distance and all the way back up again. And I have to confess that as a flatlander of quite advanced age, I was a little bit at the end of my capacities towards the end, and the friendly encouragement and the headlamp, dark by that time, Michal, has gotten me up to the rim. And then you know what he did? He said, you stay here, I get the car, which was about 16 kilometers away or whatever, and he jogged the rest on the way to get the car. Anyway, what did you do recently? The 160 kilometers in 34 hours in one go. That's 4 marathons. So I took the right person to the canyon.
He also gave presentation on climate.
I know he did, but I didn't want to mention that separately, because that is, everybody else also gave, a lot of other people also gave presentations. But to single him out at the end, I wanted to mention the things that make him special. All right. Then thank you all.
Thank you.